Don't you look tasty?
Looks like we're talking about the vampire world as well as the Star. Now, first off, the Star is an alternate version of Marceline where she fully embraces her demonic and vampiric side. Now, in order for us to understand her character and understand how she became what we now know her as, we need to understand how this world is different from our original, and let me tell you, it gets dark incredibly quickly. Now, for those of you who do not know, in this reality, Simon never was able to find Marceline. This is due to the fact that he was already dead. This version of Simon was killed rather early on by what is hinted to be the Vampire King and a collection of other lesser vampires. Due to the fact that Simon never found Marceline, he was unable to raise her into the gothic yet somewhat kind-hearted person that we end up knowing her as later. Instead, the person to find and raise her would be the Vampire King, who managed to obtain Evergreen's crown. This resulted in the Vampire King becoming one of the most powerful creatures alive and raising Marceline to be his own protege and the second most powerful vampire in all of Ood. He would train her in everything that she could possibly take advantage of, teaching her how to abuse her own soul-sucking abilities as well as her new vampiric powers. Interestingly enough, the Moon, Hierophant, and the Empress, as well as the Fool, are stated to have died long before the beginning of this story. But Marceline has each and every one of their abilities, meaning that the Vampire King most likely either directly or indirectly fed the other true vampires to her so that he could enhance her abilities even further rather than them dying by chance. It's possible that he did this to avoid competition or possible betrayal. During the time frame of the 1,000 years between the Vampire King finding and raising Marceline and the appearance of Fionna and Cake, a lot of things turned out differently. One of the major things is that the vampires become way more prominent. Considering the Vampire King obtained the crown, we know Simon had it prior to his death. At least that's what happened in the original timeline. It's possible that the Vampire King saw him use it earlier and was able to kill him through the element of surprise. Though it's also entirely possible that in this timeline, this version of Simon had never obtained the crown to begin with. I personally like this idea because at the beginning we see the sky during the flashback, and though there are clouds, the sun is not blotted out, meaning that the Vampire King either didn't have the crown yet or was unsure of how to use its powers effectively. Regardless, before or after obtaining the crown, just like in the original timeline, the vampires would hunt down the humans, draining them, kidnapping them, and occasionally turning them into vampires. Without Marceline becoming the famous vampire hunter that she's supposed to be, that means two-bred Tom and his enclave most likely never made it to the Founder's Island, meaning the dozens of humans there were most likely killed, with only a small number of humans found here and there. Though unlike before with the idea of the Founder's Island, the small number of humans is actually the final humans. Meanwhile, the number of vampires have reached an all-time high, having hundreds if not possibly thousands in total. Interestingly enough, there seems to be a pretty large lack of mutants and magical knowledge. A good example of this would be Huntress wizard in this reality, not knowing anything about magic and being for the most part fully human. It's possible that the vampires have wiped out various other mutants either for food or to remove competition for said food. It doesn't seem that any vampire is yet to find out that they can feed on red, or they simply refuse to, which resulted in the world's ecosystem completely falling apart. It seems that due to how the vampires dealt with the world, the Candy Kingdom, or any kingdom that we know of, was able to establish itself with the Vampire King stamping out any form of resistance. We don't know what happened to the Lich in this reality, though it's possible he was defeated by Billy in a similar manner or is working in the shadows. Speaking of Billy, he died somewhat recently. When we see his corpse, it shows little signs of decay. Considering he was drained of blood, as indicated by the dozens of bite marks on his body, and therefore most of the fluid in his body partially preserving him, he had to have died just a week or so prior to Fionna and Cake appearing. Looking at his body and where he was, it seems that he had attempted to rid the world of the vampiric threat, however was overwhelmed by the sheer number of said vampires and possibly the Star herself, aka Marceline. Whether he managed to escape and write the blood-written warning sign of the path that leads to the king's fortress and then succumb to its wounds, or was placed there by the vampires themselves, is unknown. Due to the fact that the sun is blotted out the vast majority of time, typical plant life has died off for the most part, with only adapted plants and fungus being able to grow in spades, with these forms of wild fungi overtaking what remains of human cities. There's also the past that occurred between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, though considering she isn't a princess in this reality, I guess Bonnie will do. To be honest with you, I got nothing. Look, I'm sorry. Though it's obvious that the two share an interesting past, I can't piece anything together because there isn't anything linking to any specific events. Literally anything could have transpired between these two within the 1,000 years that Marceline has been around. That being said, let's go over what we know. At one point, it's pretty obvious they shared some kind of relationship. This is pretty apparent when you see the obvious teasing on Marceline's part, but also the sheer anger that Bonnie shows when people people reference it, such as when Simon told her that in his reality the two fell in love. Though it's possible it's not a romantic relationship, more so an obsession between the two, kind of like a Batman and Joker situation if you would. Considering that it's very clear that the two have been at this for an incredibly long time, with Marceline actively being the main antagonist of Bonnie's life, with her being responsible for the loss of one of her eyes, it seems that Bonnie has not gotten many victories since this game of cat and mouse began. Because when Marceline called her a loser after killing one of her men and escaping, she seems to be millimeters away from a full-on breakdown. Unfortunately, that's as much info as we have no other things that lead back to the events we can think of aside from the fight that left Bonnie badly wounded. Though we may not be able to figure out what the relationship between them exactly is and what led up to it, Bonnie made her life goal to destroy her specifically, with the Vampire King more so being a bonus. That being said, it's pretty obvious that she wants to kill all the vampires, resulting in her plan to use Garbo's garlic bombs to force all the vampires outside of the hive and burn them by removing the Vampire King's crown via Huntress using an arrow to knock it off. At least that was the plan, until the Vampire King noticed Huntress and completely broke her body and riddled her with her own arrows. This resulted in a final showdown between Marceline and Bonnie, where surprisingly they were fighting somewhat evenly, though it's somewhat hinted that Marceline more so is just playing with her for giggles like all of their other encounters. Though this letting her guard down resulted in her nearly getting staked and Marceline knocking both of them into a freefall where if she stakes her she'll die anyway because the fall would either kill her or she would be torn apart by the vampires pursuing her. Something I would like to add is that this could have been avoided if Fionna had not stopped Cake from knocking the crown off, which would have resulted in most if not all the vampires in the world dying, and this action would actively save the day. Just thought that I would mention that. And just like Finn, it's not confirmed, but it's pretty apparent that either Bonnie or both of them died. Either way, the world is partially doomed since Cake couldn't take the crown. And Bonnie, one of the only remaining forms of resistance in the world, being dead, there is little to no hope. Most likely the vampires will burn through all forms of food and life, and all that will remain is fungi, the rodents who feed on the fungi, and insects, which would eventually result in the massive vampire populace to starve to death, at least until they start actually feeding on red, which could theoretically save them, but everything else will still most likely die. But that's all I got for this episode. What do you guys think? Do you think Bonnie made it out alive? What do you think will happen to this reality after Fionna and Cake abandoned it? Let me know down below. Thank you all to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are awesome, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Bye.